Hadouken! Alright.
Gets really high because the energy demand of the activity requires rapid glycolysis and glycogenolysis and produce lactate. But we've found in our research that active muscles, the heart, the liver, and the brain are all using this stuff as a fuel. So as long as you can make it and use it, you're fine.
So is there a difference between, in order to use lactate, in order for the different organs in our body to use lactate, it needs to be taken up into the cell, and then it gets into the mitochondria, and the mitochondria use this lactate as a source of energy to produce the energetic currency of the cell, ATP. Is there a difference between the type of exercise you do and or how hard you train and the ability to use this lactate, which essentially has to get transported into the cell through this specific lactate transporter?
Yeah, so you mentioned some really key words in our research. So we found that the lactate is produced, and we found that it's oxidized, and the sites of oxidation are in the mitochondria, or this network, this reticulum of a respiratory apparatus that exists in most cells. So the lactate has to get in, and it has to have a transporter. And we were amongst the first to work on discovering the lactate transporters and where they are. And our unique contribution was to find that not only are they in the plasma membranes of muscles and heart and other tissues, but they're also in the mitochondria. They are the lactate pyruvate transporter. So this whole field has been misunderstood historically. And going back to the first research of Otto Meyerhoff, who was one of our heroes in the study of metabolism, he had a half a frog hemicorpus in a jar without oxygen, without perfusion, and he stimulated the muscles to contract. And as they needed energy to contract, they produced lactate. Eventually, those muscles fatigue and dose a lot of lactate. So this is the birth of the idea that lactate causes fatigue, and that lactic acidosis is a metabolic problem. But really, in that situation, there was no oxygen for respiration. So the only thing the muscle could do was to break down glycogen and make lactate to try to provide energy. And in the end, when the glycogen was used up and the lactate was high, well, there was a metabolic crisis.
That makes sense. So in the context of a living person that's, using oxygen, and there's lots of oxygen present, like, for example, especially during action,
power output. So if we would compare myself to a young, healthy athlete, that athlete would actually be producing more lactate than I would be, but my lactate level would be really high because I'm limited in my ability to take it up and use it, whereas the athlete is superior in terms of clearing lactate and using it as a fuel, using it as a gluconeogenic precursor. So we have discovered that lactate is produced all the time at rest, and during exercise as well. And athletes actually produce more than people who are less capable or less highly trained. But they remove it, they use it.
Okay, so the athletes can produce more and they can use it better. Is that because there's something that occurs like during exercise that makes the transporters more efficient, makes more of them?
Yes, the physical activity is known to increase the mass of the mitochondrial network. Some people would say there are more mitochondria, but we know from our own work that this is a whole network, and the mitochondrial network buds and branches out with training, so you can actually double the amount of mitochondria you have in your muscle by training. So it's really one of the most incredible adaptations we know about. And as well, you can...
That I have, which I think is probably very relevant to a lot of people out there that are listening that exercise and they're athletes. Is there a certain type of exercise that is paramount in terms of doubling the mitochondrial mass, making more mitochondria, and making more of these transporters to transport lactate into the mitochondria to use it as energy? So, for example, do you, aerobic exercise like more endurance-related running, lifting weights? Is there a certain type of exercise that you found to be superior in that regard?
Yeah, we haven't, really even scratched the surface of this. But before we get too much into the science, I want to talk about my colleagues and friends who are coaches. They've known this since this metabolic crisis problem for decades, and they've tried different ways to try to mitigate the problem. So they've tried endurance training, and they've tried interval training, and they've tried combinations of endurance and interval training. And we know from our work on animals and people that endurance training does increase the mitochondrial mass and does increase the number of transporters. That's all well and good. What we don't know is how to personalize it for you and me. What do we need to do exactly to optimize our mitochondrial mass and our lactate transporter count? What exactly? We sort of know what we need to do, which is build the aerobic base, that is, do a lot of training early in the season, and then as we go, if we're going to go into competition, we need to exercise harder, we need to work on our pace, and it gets really specific about our activity. But we know from our studies that we've done with incubated muscle cells that if we just take muscle cells and we incubate them with lactate, we'll upregulate over 600 genes, all the genes basically of muscle adaptation. So there are a lot of really talented people studying muscle adaptation today, but this has again been overlooked because everybody believes lactate is bad, but it's really an upstream signal. Genes for mitochondrial biogenesis, for muscle protein synthesis, basically pretty much what happens to you when you do exercise training.
Wow, so that's fascinating, George. A little heavy on the biochem, so let me just recap that for those of you that may have gotten just a little lost. Basically, what George is saying is that lactate, in addition to being used as an energy source to produce energy for the cell, it also is a signaling molecule that seems to regulate, maybe even on an epigenetic level, where it's upregulating, meaning increasing the transcription of a variety of genes that are related to mitochondrial function and muscle adaptation. So, and presumably probably down-regulating genes as well, but essentially it's regulating a variety of different physiological processes, in the body, and I guess the muscle cell specifically is what you looked at in terms of, things that are good for the mitochondria and good for the muscle to work better and harder. Also, I think that the interesting thing that you mentioned about this personalized training, I think that's a very interesting concept because, you're right, there's a lot of different factors. It's not just endurance versus, interval training. There's age, there's gender, there's a lot of, there's how...
You did really simplify it by talking about epigenetics, but we'll come back to that. But again, our colleagues who are coaches have actually used what's called a lactate threshold as a point of training. And so sometimes for endurance training, people will train below the lactate threshold, just below it. And that seems to result in significant mitochondrial biogenesis. But then to exercise really hard, coaches know you need to exercise above the threshold occasionally. But that's too hard to do on a daily basis. So coaches and athletes have learned just empirically to measure lactate. They don't really completely understand what it's doing, but they know that when it's too high, it's bad. When it's increasing, it's too hard. And if the lactate is really low, it's probably too easy training. So coaches and athletes are using what they call threshold training quite effectively. And you can see as people do their endurance training, the lactate level for a given power output really falls. So that allows them then to ramp up their training and ramp up their competitive pace and be able to function effectively at a higher power output. So there are various things that people can do to track their training. One is to measure their heart rate. Another thing is to measure their lactate. You need devices to do this. Another thing to do is to work on their breathing. Because as the lactate starts to rise, this acidosis goes on, and I often talk to people about using the talk test. So when we were actually, if we were on 2 treadmills here, when we were having this conversation and kept going faster and faster, we'd get to the point where we couldn't talk anymore. That's probably we're acidotic now, right? So our lactate would be really high. So we can actually use our breathing as a measure of where we need to train.
That's very interesting. So because the amount of oxygen that we're able to take in and bring to our various cells, including the muscle, then really is the limiting factor in the sense where, because if you don't have enough oxygen there, the lactate you produce isn't going to get used. It's going to pile up. Can you explain? Because when our muscles produce lactate, and all the cells, like our lymphocytes, our
red blood cells.
Right. I'm talking about in the context of exercise because I think that's what people mostly relate it to. But when we do produce, lactate, how does it get converted into lactic acid?
Well, if you look at the glycolytic pathway, it actually makes lactate. But lactate is a pretty strong acid, so it associates with water, and a certain amount of acidosis that will be associated with the lactate itself. But glycolysis actually makes lactate, not lactic acid. The acidosis, the hydrogen ions come from other processes, like the splitting of ATP, which is our high energy source. So we split that, we liberate a proton. So when you're splitting your ATP, you're not able to keep it its level high. You're going to develop protons, and the lactate's going to be there, and people are going to associate the proton with the lactate and call it lactic acid. This is a big misnomer and big mistake in biology.
And at physiological pH, does the lactic acid form its lactate, or
the PK? Okay, it's about 3. If there was lactic acid, it would be completely dissociated to a lactate anion and a proton. But, one of my inventions early on was to make what I call polylactate, which is in the steas. That's really, I think, one of the reasons we formed this collaboration with UCLA, because when people have traumatic brain injury, there's a series of things would happen. There might be an acidosis, there might be a lack of oxygen, there's swelling which goes on. And by giving salt of lactate, we can mitigate the swelling, we can provide fuel, and we can manage the acidosis which occurs.
Yeah, so this is a great transition into the brain. But before we get to that real quick, I have one question for you. Now, you were on a committee, a scientific advisory committee. Some years ago, you were asked to be on that, recommends the amount of daily exercise that a person should get. And the Surgeon General of this committee, I think, recommended 30 minutes a day. But you recommended twice that. You recommended 1 hour a day. Can you elaborate on why that is, why we all should be exercising 1 hour a day?
Well, we didn't say we need to exercise, everybody needs to exercise an hour a day, but this is a report we wrote. I was on the committee, and it's called Dietary Reference Intakes. And this was the scientific basis behind what were going to become the dietary recommendations. And we turned the whole thing around. So in the past, you would say, well, what should you eat? And you would say, you need to eat some carbohydrates, you need some lipids, you need some fats, and so on. And then people would recommend proportions and amounts. We decided to first ask the question, what are you doing? What's your energy expenditure? And then you need to eat to feed that. So instead of 2 portions of this and 3 portions of that, we decided to base the whole thing on energy. And what we found by looking at the doubly labeled water database, which was generously donated by almost every investigator who ever did a study, is that people who are healthy and lean and freely living, that is eating whatever they want, they're active about an hour a day. Now, it's true, there's good epidemiological research to indicate that if you do some activity, like 30 minutes a day, you'll improve cardiovascular function, you'll reduce your risk of heart disease and diabetes and maybe some forms of cancer. But that's not enough activity to control your body weight. So you need to be active on the average about an hour a day. And that's not running on the treadmill for an hour. It's doing the equivalent of brisk walking taking the stairs, going to the bus stop, walking my students between classes, people on their jobs, perhaps standing, moving around once in a while. So people who are active about an hour a day can manage your body weight and be healthier because of the activity. And the activity is just really incredible because physical activity, I say, works from the tip of your toes to the top of your head. It'll build your bone mass. It'll build your muscle mass. It'll help your cardiovascular conditioning. It will help your endocrine functioning. And it actually goes up to the brain and is used as a fuel there. And it might stimulate what's called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So that's another whole field we probably don't have time to talk about. But there are things released from active muscles into the blood during activity that promote cell proliferation, like in the brain with the BDNF, or stimulate or repress cancer cells. So, for instance, if somebody is regularly active, why is the incidence of colon cancer reduced? Why is the incidence of breast cancer reduced? Well, these tissues are not really involved in the activity per se, but there's something released from active tissues that circulates, which helps all tissues. And we think that might be lactate, but there could be cytokines, there could be micromolecules. There's probably some combination of factors released from working muscle that gets around the body, makes people feel better, and makes their tissues feel better. And of course, if you do enough activity, you can lose weight, but you can be healthier without losing weight. So, depending on your day,
Interesting, because
isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, lactate, like you mentioned earlier, it seems to be not only the source of energy, but it seems to be a signaling molecule as well. So it's something that is good for the cells. It's good for, many different cells, including cells in our brain. And something else that's very interesting, very recently, I think it was a group in the Netherlands, they showed that lactate actually stimulates these neurons in a brain region called the locus coeruleus, which is where all the norepinephrine neurons are. So these neurons that make norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is that neurotransmitter that's involved in focus and attention. And they've shown that actually specifically lactate stimulates the release of norepinephrine from those locus coeruleus neurons. And if you think about it, I know from my own personal experience that after I exercise, I definitely have better focus and attention. So, this is something that seems very relevant for people with, for example, ADHD or people that have problem focusing, and putting their attention to one thing. Get out and move, get some exercise. It seems like the best medicine you can possibly have.
So the terminology we use here connotes meaning, right? So I remember being a student and learning about the blood-brain barrier, and I thought there was this extra membrane that the brain was wrapped in.
Right.
And that's not the case at all. Things get into the brain cells by transporters. Mm-hmm. And these lactate transporters are highly expressed in all the capillaries in our body, and including in our astrocytes and our neurons. So lactate permeates through the brain. When it's high, it goes in. And because lactate simply moves down a concentration gradient. And so the way to increase that concentration is, well, one way is like we're trying to do with our patients to infuse it, but these are people who are in coma and they can't move around. Maybe we can try electrical stimulation to get their muscles going to fuel their brain. But the way we usually do it is we move around.
Right.
And it goes to our brain. And I don't know if you ever noticed this, after you're exercising, you get hungry, but later. Not right away.
Yes.
Because the lactate is crossing the blood-brain barrier. It's probably going to the centers in the brain that regulate appetite, and it's mildly suppressive.
Interesting.
And but then when the lactate clears, is used, while the body uses it, then you get hungry.
The brain says, "Feed me." Right. So this concept of lactate helping with traumatic brain injury, you mentioned you're doing current research in collaboration with researchers at UCLA. And I read, a couple of papers recently on this topic of lactate in terms of patients that were had moderate to severe traumatic brain injury. And they had higher levels of lactate in their bloodstream, they had a better outcome. And those patients that did not have an intact blood-brain barrier, that wasn't the same for them. So can you explain why lactate would help people recover better from traumatic brain injury?
Sure. Can I tell you a story first? Just in this office, almost 8 years ago, the chief of neurosurgery at UCLA, Dr. Neil Martin, and one of his chief scientists, Dr. Tom Glenn, we had a conversation in his office about this. And they noticed that in their patients who did better, as you described, the lactate was elevated, and the people whose brains could take it up did better. And that means that they recovered quicker, and their intellectual functions were restored pretty much as they were before they were injured. And they wrote a grant, and the grant went to the NIH, and they said, well, you just don't understand. So they looked in the literature, and they came to us because we've been dealing with this issue for decades. People just think we're crazy because stuff obviously is bad. It can't be helpful. So we started working with patients, and we have recently, and it does a couple
This is
things.
my last game. I'm done.
It can get across this blood-brain barrier.
I have no investment, no emotional investment here.
The other thing it does normally is the lactate goes, of course, to the liver. It gets made into glucose, and glucose is usually used as a fuel for the brain. Now, to answer your question about why is the injured brain suffering, for some reason, the breakdown of sugar or glycolysis in the brain is impaired after injury. And the product of that is lactate. And neurons run on lactate as the preferred fuel. So in part, the brain is starving. So you can try to give more glucose by putting that in the blood. But again, the process is blocked. So our approach is to bypass that by infusing formulations containing lactate, salts, and esters, and other lactate-containing compounds that will get into the brain through the blood-brain barrier and get into the mitochondria and fuel the brain. And we actually have done 6 patients in collaboration with our colleagues at UCLA. We can show that we can increase the carbohydrate uptake, that is the total glucose plus lactate, in people with brain injury by infusing lactate.
Wow. Do you think that some of the glucose that is in the brain, instead of being used for an energy source, is actually being used to produce things like NADPH, so it's going through this different metabolic pathway called the pentose phosphate pathway,
yes,
so that you can make things that are essentially going to be used as antioxidants by things like glutathione, peroxidase, and these other antioxidant enzymes that are in the brain. Do you think that lactate will then allow glucose to be used for that instead of as energy for neurons?
Yeah, so you're talking about sparing.
Yes.
You're talking about glucose sparing, and so you described very nicely the pentose phosphate pathway and some of the things it does. So there's a limitation in the amount of glucose, but if we can fuel the brain with lactate, then the glucose that is available can do that.
Pretty cool for this guy.
Yeah.
So just kill it.
Which is very important because
it's very important. Our approach as physiologists to this issue, we talk about the body supporting the brain. Too often in the past, people get into silos. So if I'm a muscle physiologist, I don't care about the brain. And if I'm a neurosurgeon, I really want to feed the brain. That's where my patients are, and that's what I have to do. But we have to just step back and say, hey,
I didn't know you could do that. That's pretty cool.
To nourish, we have to realize that the body is going to nourish the brain. And one of our conversations I had with one of our colleagues, Dr. Paul Vespa, who's a neurologist who really takes care of the patients after the surgery is over. Dr. Vespa, I said, the body is a thief.
What about this? Can it trigger?
He looked at me and he got it
Please
right away.
Yeah, it's a fucking mistake. Another one! What a fucking miracle, huh?
By standard of care.
Wow.
The best physicians in the most highly advanced medical centers are concerned with bleeding and oxygenation, and it's really hard to nourish people in these circumstances, to feed them, they're unconscious, they can't eat. You have to put in tubes, you have to put in things to go in the blood, things to go.
Beautiful. I mean, nothing's fucking working. Don't you love that? Wow, fuck you. Go. No choice, just like a rape. I can't wait for you fuckers to go bankrupt. I really can't wait. Cast out. Yeah, that's fine. Cast out is actually fair, but doesn't work just because. That kind of sucks. Wow. You get to rest something, really? Okay. That's fair, I guess. No choice, I got a block. Oh my god. I mean, really, fuck wizards. This thing survived by 1 damage. 1 damage. Which is the strike of that card right there. I'm just calling it a day. I'm done. Another lane card.
Supplementation with lactate. There's L-lactate and there's
Oh
D-lactate.
man, well, let's see. For
Supplementing with L-lactate.
No, it's game over. It doesn't matter what I do. Let's see. You can make any creature unblockable. Fuck, man. I mean, 1 fucking damage, you could have killed this shit. Then I could have played this, play this, and kill this shit. Right? He won't have. Oh well, we would have still lost. Alright, you win, I guess. You win. Oh yeah, but I'm done. I'm just gonna go away. I mean, fuck you. Learn how to program. Go back to school. Oh man, you people suck. You people really fucking suck. I mean, the fucking product on the 3-2 cost me the game, pretty much. So that's